Despite widespread, deep, and fierce fan base, the 30-06 cartridge will go obsolete. And we're going to explain how on this episode of Ron Spomer Outdoors Podcast. Hey, everybody. I was writing a piece for my blog, and gosh, it's kind of got to be so interesting even to me that I thought I would read it to you guys here on this podcast. Now, many of you are going to miss the visuals if you're not watching this on the YouTube podcast channel. So if you want to see some of the stuff we're talking about, I would advise you to go there. But I'm going to try to make it interesting enough just as a podcast so that you might want to dive a little bit deeper into the old 30-06 cartridge. Now, let me read to you some of what I have been writing. Listeners have asked for this. This is why we're covering the old 30-06. You would think in this day and age of all the new PRC cartridges and the 6.8 Western, all these short, fat, speedy ones, why would anybody still be interested in the 30-06? Well, the reason we came up with this is we did some videos and reviews of 308 rifles. We called it 308 Week several months ago, and it was pretty successful and well received. So we said, hey, do you like this idea of comparing all these different rifles in a specific cartridge chambering? And if so, which would you like to see next? And to our surprise, the vast majority chose the 30-06. Now, that would make some sense if our demographics were mostly the boomers like me who know this cartridge really well. But it turns out that we actually have a pretty good balance of age groups watching these shows and listening to these podcasts. And actually, the bulk of them are in the about 35 to 45-year-old range. So either these guys also know and use the 30-06, or they've heard enough about it that they're curious. So this is why we're covering the 30-06 week. And we reviewed some 12 different rifles in 30-06, including some lever actions and some auto loaders, something different. So you might want to check those out. That's on the Ron Spomer Outdoors YouTube channel. But I thought to sort of prime those shows, I would do on the podcast some weird facts and figures about the 30-06 and why I think it's going to go obsolete despite that incredible fan base. So listen up. Here we go. Now, this is a 118-year-old cartridge, so it's kind of surprising that it hasn't gone obsolete already, but it's got a lot of attributes that keep it in the running. One of which, of course, is this incredible range of bullet weights that it shoots, and a couple of those are right here, going from one of the smallest, 100 grain, 0.308 inch diameter bullet. That's a 30 caliber bullet weighing about what a 243 bullet would, 100 grains. But that's at the bottom end, and a lot of guys use that for plinking, or at least the hand loaders do. I don't think you can find a commercial round loaded for it. Then toward the top end, we've got one of these high, sleek, high BC modern bullets from Berger. This is a 210 grain. So that's quite a spread in weights, which makes that 30-06 so versatile. And that's one of the reasons it's so popular and well loved. But again, if you're buying factory loads, you're not going to find the extremes very often. So you have to be a hand loader to take advantage of those 125 grain, 130 grain. Most of the factory loads, you can find a few 125s maybe, but most are going to start at 150. Then you're going to see a lot in 165 to 168, then up to 180, a few in the 190 range. And some guys really like that big old 220 grain round nose for a lot of punch at close range. You can find a few of those. But if you hand load, man, the sky is the limit. All right. Now, weird facts about the 30-06. The maximum average chamber pressure as established by SAMI is just 60,000 PSI. That's not a particularly low number, but it's not as high as it could be. Now, why is it when some of the offshoots of the 30-06 are rated for 65,000 PSI? And specifically, that's the 270 Winchester and the 280 Ackley improved. Those are essentially built off of the same case. Hand loaders will take a 30-06 and neck it down and form it into the 270 Winchester or the 280 AI. And those get 65,000 PSI. So what is the big deal with that? Now, you might think that the first 30-06 rifle, that would be the Springfield 1903 bolt action used in World War I, maybe that was too weak for the higher pressures. But that's not the case, because many of those rifles have been modified, sporterized, shall we say, and rechambered or rebarreled for the 270 Winchester. And that wouldn't surprise me if a few guys have done it with the 280 AI, and that's pushing the pressures up. And also, pretty much all the rifles out there that you can buy, Remington 700s and Savages and Marlins, and anybody who chambers for the 30-06 probably chambers those same rifles for the 270. Same action, same barrels, diameters, and everything else. If it can handle the pressures of the 270, why not get the pressures up in the 30-06? Now, some others might say it was the Garand, the M1 Garand, the autoloader from World War II, because of it's a push rod, couldn't take the pressures or maybe the timing issues, so they had to throttle it back. But the 30-06 chamber pressures were already established some 30 years before the Garand even came out. So I don't think that's the right answer, although there are special low-power Garand loads that you should be shooting in that rifle on 30-06. So I don't think that's the reason why it was 60,000. Maybe it was just the era. 1906 getting back there pretty far, and they just weren't used to those extreme pressures yet. It didn't take long, though, because I think it was 1925 or 26 that the 270 came out, and that was pushed up to 65. And then the 22-250 Remington, that really didn't come out until the 1969 or so, but it'd been a Wildcat going way back into, I think, the 1920s or 30s. So the pressure on that one's also 65,000 PSI. So I think they had the steels to handle this stuff way back when. At any rate, that kind of throttles back the performance of the 30-06. Hand loaders can beat it, knowing that it is safe in some of these numbers. And then factory ammunition is really not all that far behind, because as we're going to see here, things have really increased in performance over the years. So the next weird fact I want to cover are dimensions. These are really strange. Now, the 30-06 as a parent cartridge for a whole bunch of others is pretty well known because it has a rim diameter of 0.473 right out here at the rim. That's the SAMI specifications. I looked at all of these loads from all of these different brands you see here in the boxes. Sig Sauers and Normas and Remingtons and Winchesters, Swift cartridges, Hornady, and none of them come close to being a 0.473 inch diameter rim. Some of the numbers I came up with, the lowest, the narrowest one I found was from Hornady, and it was 0.465 of an inch on the rim. And the closest one to 0.473 really wasn't all that close. It was 0.469, and that was the Norma load. So what gives with those rim diameters? Now the head, and that is the area just where the webbing is inside, where the brass is thick all the way through, and then the primer hole gets punched through that. That area right there, the diameter of it is supposed to be 0.470. That's the nominal number, but they don't come close either. The narrowest one was the Swift cartridge, and that was 0.462. And the fattest one that came closest looks like it was about 0.466, and that's the Norma. So things are a little bit undersized consistently here. I think I know why, and we'll discuss that in a bit. Now, case length, and this is not with the bullet on it, just the case itself. That is supposed to be 2.494 inches. Closest we came was 2.489, the way it looks. Yeah, and the shortest one was 2.475. Now, that is not really a critical number. The critical thing about case length is that it cannot exceed that 2.494, because the case then could fit inside of the throat where it's narrowed down for the bullet diameter, and you can raise pressures by pinching it, essentially pinching it shut against the bullet. You can shorten things quite a bit, and hand loaders do that when it's time to trim the necks of their cases. And then there's the cartridge overall length, the standard for the 30-06, and this is known as your standard length action or 30-06 length action and or cartridge, supposed to be 3.34 inches. Of course, none of these are. The shortest one was 3.215, and that was at Norma again. Here's one at 3.217. wait a minute, here's a 30-06 load. This is an older one from, back in the 90s when they had this fail-safe bullet, 180 grain fail-safe. Pretty blunt nosed bullet. They've got that thing shoved down into the case so that the overall length of it, and this is this one right here with that black bullet on top, quite short. It's only 3.086 of an inch long. Now the longest one here looks to be this Winchester, and it is 3.323. And yes, sir, that is the longest one of the bunch. So that really isn't critical either. And the bullet shape is going to determine a lot of that. Obviously, if we put just a little 100 grain on here, you're not going to come close to getting maximum length out of it. All right. Now, we need to discuss a little bit of the history of the .06. I think most people know it was called the 30-06 because it's a 30 caliber and it came out in 1906. And quite a few folks know that it was based off of an earlier cartridge, a military round, the 1903. That one shot a 220 grain round nose bullet. Shortly after we made it, we determined that it was a little old-fashioned already because the Germans with their Mauser, and this is the 8mm German Mauser right here, had been fitted out with a new bullet that was long, sleek pointed, a Spitzer, they called it, a spire point, and lighter weight, and it was going a lot faster, or at least shooting a lot flatter and reaching farther than this big old round nose 30-06 or that time 30-03 cartridge. So that's why they changed it, gave it a 150 grain spire point bullet, pushed it 2,700 feet per second, called it the ball cartridge of 1906, and nobody wanted to call it cartridge ball caliber 30 of 06 or whatever military called it. So we shortened it to 30 of the year 1906, 30 caliber 06. That's why it's the 30-06. And aught, for you young guys, is an old term for zero. The old timers used to say aught when they went zero. Over in Europe, a lot of people say naught. So yeah, really you should say 30-06, but that sounds corny. So there's the 30-06. Now, what most of us don't know is that the 30-06 actually came from the 8x57 Mauser, or perhaps the 7x57 Mauser, which itself sprang from the 1988 8x57 Mauser. Whew, that's kind of where it all got started. The diameter of the rim on this is supposed to be 0.473. It's not. I measured this one and it's 0.465. And the 757 that came from it's also supposed to be 0.473, but it is, on this one anyway, 0.467. So, things are just not measuring up. Why is this? I think Sammy sets these standards, the nominal number, and then they have tolerances. You can go smaller, you can go a little bit larger, because I think in manufacturing, it's just hard to hit those numbers exactly, right? So you have to have your chambers and your cartridges all fitting within these numbers so they can be a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger. I would imagine they'll err on the side of a little bit undersized so that they will not have any trouble fitting any rifles. I mean, you can imagine if you bought yourself a 30-06 and you had a particular load that was really right there at those numbers, it didn't fit, the chamber was a little bit too tight, you would not be happy. Whereas if it's a little bit undersized and it just fits right in there with no issues, you really don't even notice how much undersized it is. Although to be precise, it would be great to hit those numbers so we're awfully close. And that's what some of the match grade barrels and such are these days. And some of these new cartridges like the PRCs are set up to be that precise. We've got the machining now that we can do that, computer assisted and measured and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of an interesting history. Another thing interesting about this history on that 30-06 is that we got sued by Mauser or Germany, and we were actually paying because not only was the 30-06 looking pretty similar to that 8x57 cartridge, but so was the Springfield 03 bolt action rifle. That was really a Mauser ripoff. So the Germans had actually won, I think, a lawsuit to make us pay to build these things. But then when World War I broke out, the heck with that. We're not going to be paying our enemies during war for patent infringement or anything like that. All right. Now, of course, we know the 30-06 is then subsequently remodeled into all sorts of other cartridges, not just the 270, but the 280 Remington, the 25-06 Remington. And then it got shortened down to make the 308 family of cartridges. And there's just all sorts of them based on the 30-06. That's one of the reasons that it is just so popular. All right. Now, here's something interesting. The 30-06 still is the most powerful standard issue battle cartridge in world history. Nobody else ever put one out there that shot harder. So that 150 grain bullet at initially it was at 2,700 feet per second, and that thing was cranking out about 2,500 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. These days with new powders and such, you're getting up there at pretty regularly 2,900 feet per second to as much as 3,000 with the 150 grain bullets. So going really a lot faster. And of course, that's also pushed your energies up. And now we're going to find out about why that helps the 30-06 remain relevant to this day. It competes pretty nicely with most of the faster, more powerful cartridges, or at least we imagine them to be. So we're going to look at some of those. But first, I want to talk about a little bit of history about this cartridge jumping from the military to the civilian use, the hunting fields. We went from the battlefield to the hunting field really quickly. At the earliest I could come up with was Teddy Roosevelt. He got one of the military rifles, of which he was kind of a principal designer. If not designer, at least he said, we need to get this done. After he came back from Cuba during that Spanish-American War, and we met the 757 Mauser that the Spanish had, that's where he said, "Woo, boy, we've got to do better than the 30-40 Craig that we've got, or the 45-70 that we're shooting. So let's get to work and design this new cartridge and a rifle to shoot it," because the rifles were really fast too. Stripper clips, a lot of rounds in the magazine. So that's how that Springfield 03 rifle and eventually the 06 cartridge came to be. So Teddy Roosevelt, former president, got out of office and said, it's time to have some fun. Let's go to Africa on a big safari and shoot some game and find some new species perhaps for the Smithsonian Institute. Over he and Kermit go, that's his son. And they have this year-long safari, and he's using a Springfield 1903 rifle in 30-06. It was actually chambered for the 03, but he just shot the 30-06 in it because it fit. Now, this is something else a lot of people say about 30-06 and the 03. The 03's case length was a little bit longer than the 30-06 because it had that long 220 grain round nose bullet on it. To grip it well and make sure it was straight and all, they went with a pretty long neck. Didn't need it on that 150 grain, and I think that's why they trimmed it down a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. And I just took a measurement to show you how much is a little bit. If you can see the gap in this caliper, that's the difference between the length of the 03 and the 06. Not a big deal. As an aside, a lot of folks will say that the 03 case was the one used to make the 270, not the 06. I don't know about that, but it certainly could be because the 03 and the 270 are the same case length. But if you neck down a 30-06 and squeeze it down, the neck stretches out a little bit to come darn close to what the standard is for the 270. And a lot of us do that when we're hand loading. We'll take a 30-06 case, run it through the die on a 270, and off we go. So at any rate, that's kind of fun. Now, Roosevelt went over there in 1909 with his Springfield, and he wasn't the greatest shot in the world. He had some poor eyesight. You see photos of him with glasses. So he had some challenges. Plus, he didn't have a scope. He was just using open sights. And I've read his book, African Game Trails. Great read, but he is shooting a lot of stuff at 300 plus yards with open sights. So no wonder he didn't have a high success rate. But at any rate, he loved that 30-06, and it obviously did the job. And that inspired an author of the day, Stuart Edward White, to take one over as well. He had Griffin and Howe in New York sporterize the 03 and make it a little handier for hunting. Took it over in a 30-06 and did really well. And I think that probably led to Ernest Hemingway in the 1930s going over there with a 30-06. And he famously shot a rhinoceros running 300 yards away and killed it with one shot. Or so the story goes. And then there was the famous Robert Rourke of Use Enough Gun fame and Horn of the Hunter book fame, an author from the middle 20th century. He really put Africa safaris on the map, and he took a 30-06 over too. So that's kind of some of the famous folks who used it and really helped push it. Obviously, Jack O'Connor used it a lot, but once he discovered the 270, he preferred it. And we're going to look at some numbers to show how those two compare. You might be surprised at how closely the 30-06 treads on the heels of the 270, not to mention the 280 Ackley improved. So let's get back to the power now of this 30-06 with modern cartridges. Generally, your 150 grain bullets are going 2,900 to 3,000 feet per second, and that gets you 2,800 foot-pounds of energy. That is a lot of bullet energy, guys. This is more energy, get this, than a high pressure load for the 45-70, not the kind of the standard ones at 1,300 feet per second. This one's pushed up to 1,600 feet per second with a 405 grain bullet. And that one does not produce as much muzzle energy as the 30-06 with a 150 grain bullet. This is what velocity does for you guys. But the really interesting thing is it's 30-06 here is pretty darn close to the 280 Ackley improved. And I built some charts here, some numbers on cartridges just to see how the 30-06 stacked up. And I don't have time to go through all of these, but I think most of you might be surprised to see or learn or hear that the 30-06 outperforms the 6.5 Creedmoor in several categories. Shoot that 143 grain bullet with a really high B of 0.625 at 2,750 feet per second out of the 6.5 Creedmoor, and zero it to go no higher than 3 inches at its maximum peak above your sight line. That means you're going to drop 4.7 inches at 300 yards, whereas the 30-06 with a 150 grain bullet drops 3.2 inches at 300 yards. It's flatter shooting. Yeah, well, at least 300 yards. Let's see, at 400 yards, you're dropping 17.6 with the 6.5, and a 30-06 is only dropping 15. So it's still winning. Now, in the wind department, the higher BC bullet in the 6.5 does beat it a little bit. At 300 yards, you're getting 5 inches of drift out of the 6.5, and the 30-06 is getting 6.6. Not a huge difference, but, you know. And then at 400 yards, 9 inches out of the 6.5 and 12 inches out of the 30-06. But look at the energies. You're hanging on to 1,594 foot-pounds of energy at 400 yards with the little 150 grain bullet in the 30-06. Remember, 1,500 is kind of the standard for an elk bullet. That's what you want for elk. Well, 30-06 is hanging right in there out to 400 yards. But can't complain about the 6.5 Creedmoor because that hangs into 1,536 foot-pounds itself. Now, again, this is a benefit of that efficient high BC bullet. And if you want to go out to 500 yards, yeah, the 30-06 starts to suffer a little bit, especially in wind. You're getting about 5 inches more wind deflection. And you're actually keeping just under the energy level of that 6.5 bullet, which is going to surprise a lot of people. But I think the main point is most of us take our game well inside of 500 yards, and you're hanging on to enough power for elk to 500. So now what about that 270? It's got a little bit flatter trajectory. 400 yards, you got 13 inches of drop. And again, the 30-06 is 15. Wind deflection, there's only an inch advantage to the 270 with a 130 grain bullet. And you know, the 270 is so famous for being faster and flatter than the 30-06. This was the big race in the middle of the 20th century. Jack O'Connor wrote about it endlessly. But there really wasn't that much, and still isn't that much difference between them. I mean, an inch difference in drop at 400 yards? Poof. What's the big deal? The 270 hangs on to pretty good energy, 1,543 at 400 yards, whereas that 30-06 is a little bit more at 1,594. So I think the point is 30-06 right here is hanging right in there with the 270. So, okay, let's say you figure the 270 is an old FUD cartridge too. So what's the big deal? How about that 280 Ackley improved? Everybody's in love with that one these days. How's that doing? We're going to throw a 150 grain bullet, 3,000 feet per second. And at 400 yards, it is dropping 13.6 inches to the 30-06 with a 150 grain bullet dropping 15 inches. Not that much difference. Wind deflection, you got 10 inches on the 280 AI, 12 inches on the 30-06. 2 inches of difference on the size of a deer? I don't think so, guys. It's just not that far behind. What about energy? 280 AI at 400 yards hangs on to 1788 compared to 1594 on the 30-06. So yeah, got a little bit more energy there. But again, those are both well over the standards for elk, let alone deer, and that's generally considered to be 1,000 foot-pounds. Not that that's exact, but what the hey. I think it gives us all the information we need to know that the 30-06 can do the job out to 400 yards and probably even 500 because the numbers hang in there clear out to that far. And of course, you can go to the heavier bullets. 165 grain, I think, is probably optimum for the 30-06. And in that case, you do hang on to 1,700 plus foot-pounds of energy at 400 yards. And your drops in your wind deflection are within an inch of the 150 grain. And then the 180 grain bullet, that's kind of the standard for elk, moose, and the other big animals with the 30-06. And again, you're getting more energy at the muzzle and you're hanging on to 1,744 foot-pounds of energy out at 400 yards. It's very similar to these more modern cartridges that most of us assume are vastly superior, but they really aren't. And this is why the 30-06 could and probably should hang in there for a long, long time. So why did I start this thing off by saying, I think it's going obsolete? This is kind of I sort of cheated on this one, guys, because it's going to go obsolete eventually because every cartridge goes obsolete eventually. Technology just suggests this is going to happen. Who knows what we're going to be shooting 50 years from now or 100 years from now, or if we'll even be allowed to shoot anything, politics being what it is in the world. Maybe we'll be shooting lasers. Maybe we won't be shooting anything at all. But eventually, like all things, including Tyrannosaurus Rex, the 30-06 is going to become obsolete. But man, if you're a hunter right now in the 21st century, and I think moving forward for the rest of your life, if you get a 30-06, you are not behind the curve at all. This cartridge, despite its advanced age, is a great option for an all around, and that's why it has that reputation. It can pretty much do anything and everything. With it, I have taken the world's biggest moose, the biggest deer in the world, Alaska Yukon moose. I have taken the biggest antelope in the world, and given the chance, I wouldn't hesitate to try it on buffalo. I know a lot of folks have, and it works just great. So if you are thinking that the 30-06 is an old dog that needs to go to bed, check out our videos on all these rifles that are still chambered for that, and almost everyone's still chambered for the 30-06. You can find used rifles, new rifles, all kinds of ammunition, and if you hand load, sky's the limit. 30-06 is going obsolete, but not in your lifetime. Certainly not in mine. Now, one little aside I want to throw out here has to do with this 757 and that mangled bullet. You see that bent tip on top of that bullet? If you were watching, you're going to see it. Obviously, if you're just listening to the podcast, you won't, which again is why I suggest you go to the YouTube podcast channel, Ron Spomer Outdoors YouTube channel, and you can see this. Look at how mangled that tip is. See that? That is kind of a classic 20th century exposed lead tip that a lot of folks still love. It's a great system, but this is why we invented these polymer tips, or why they're so popular now. Those were stuck on the bullets to prevent this kind of tip mangling that you got with the soft lead. How did this mangling start? I dropped it. That's all. I just dropped it and it hit right on the tip and bent it like this. That is going to influence the ballistics coefficient of that bullet and potentially its accuracy, but not a lot. Not a lot. If you're hunting within 300 yards, I don't think you need to worry about that. But I just wanted to put it out there to show you, demonstrate why these exposed lead tips became less popular than the polymer tips. Tip damage. So that, I think, wraps up my little dissertation here on the 30-06. Again, go to my regular channel and check out all of these rifles that we're going to be shooting. A dozen rifles chambered for 30-06. We put a lot of ammunition down range on this one, and you might be surprised at what some of these rifles can and can't do. And I think you're going to be shocked at which one of these rifles proved to be the most accurate. That was a real eye-opener. So thanks for listening to Ron Spomer Outdoors Podcast. We sure enjoy having you folks. Let me know what you think about the 30-06 and what you think I got wrong about it, and or what I neglected to mention about it that you think is really important. But know that the 30-06 is still with us and will be for a long, long time before it does finally go obsolete. This is Ron Spomer. Thanks for watching. Hunt honest and shoot straight.